Hey, welcome back to Road Tripping with Rachel. I'm Rachel. Thank you so much for joining me on this last study of the book of Nehemiah. When we are talking about specifically Orthodoxy and Orthopraxy, Orthodoxy is what you believe. So it is having an orthodox belief. Orthopraxy is how those beliefs are actively worked out. So there is this sort of tension that exists over does your orthodoxy influence your orthopraxy, or does your orthopraxy influence your orthodoxy? Then we also have syncretism. So syncretism is basically when you have two different ideas that merge and work together. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. It just depends on the situation and what we are actually looking at and talking about. We've seen it happen at different times throughout history. For example, the Roman Empire was very good at syncretism. They would really embrace and bring in a lot of the cultural quirks for any of the nations that they conquered. Those are some definitions we just needed to get out of the way. Now let's go on ahead and launch in for our last section of Nehemiah. As we're going through this, Nehemiah has been gone, and now he returns to Israel, and it's been a pretty big chunk of time by this point. So he is a contemporary of Ezra. We're actually going to be jumping into Ezra here next, but the two of them are contemporaries. They arrived not quite together, but pretty close to it. And when Nehemiah returns, because remember, he has done a lot with reform and administration and getting the people up to where they need to be as far as on an administrative level, like a national level, like defenses, all those kinds of things. So as we are here now, when we get into chapter 3, we really see where syncretism of the sacred and the secular are now mixing in ways they were never supposed to. So with this, we start to see that the priesthood is allowing people who are not Israelites and they are not priests into the temple. Now this was actually like a pretty big no-no. Because the Hebrew people were meant to be a people that was set apart. They weren't supposed to allow a bunch of foreigners to come into the temple, mainly because a lot of the foreigners so these would be the people who surrounded Israel during biblical times, they did not worship God. They a lot of their cultural practices were in direct contradiction to what God talks about throughout Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, and they were considered like outside of the covenant that the Israelite people had with God. So therefore, they were not supposed to be in there. It was the idea of culturally, like as a people, being separate from the world that is around them. We see that same idea. It plays out later on in the New Testament where Paul says, you're supposed to be a new creation. You're set apart. You're a royal priesthood. That is, which was actually Peter, but that is supposed to be how the Israeli people were operating. And so to have a bunch of people coming in who weren't supposed to be there, that was a contradiction to their beliefs. They were practicing something they didn't believe, but because they were practicing it, they acted as though that was what they did believe. This was also indicative that there wasn't respect for the things that God had set apart. In particular, there was a gentleman who had actually been a thorn in Nehemiah's side towards the beginning. He is actually like staying in the temple, like he has his own room in the temple. That's a no-no. And it was a really big deal, and the fact that this priest allowed it to happen, the one who was in charge of the storerooms, really, like, that was something that should have disqualified him from the priesthood. And it was indicative for the Hebrew people. It was saying that these are things that are okay to do. They were becoming lackadaisical in their beliefs, and they were not living out the things that they were saying that they believed. Really, like, this is a major problem that they've had. You know, I've said later on, and you'll read about it in Ezra because it's going to come up again in multiple ways, but the idea of, like, there wasn't supposed to be intermarriages, that was really a spiritual issue. But the same thing can be said that problem really started, you know, you had your moments pre-Solomon, but then you have Solomon, and he brought in so many wives and so many concubines, and then he began to keep the ladies happy. He began to erect all these different places of worship that weren't the temple, that were to all these other gods, you know, for the wives, because he needed to keep them happy. That was on a national scale, but that shows what it was doing, that they were trying to combine their lifestyles, and instead of them being able to say, like, no, I'm going to remain faithful, they began being like, oh, well, she's really pretty. I really want to marry her because she's really pretty, and, you know, like, we'll just go on ahead and we'll put them gods, like, in the living room, you know, we'll just have them in the corner, and, you know, like, 5 years down the road, they're front and center. You have a whole shrine in your house to it. And that was really the problem that was coming up. Additionally, like, the temple wasn't being supported anymore. The whole idea of there being a tithe within the Old Testament was because that was how you paid for the Levites to be able to dedicate themselves to the leading of worship and everything that entitled. And when they weren't tithing, that means, like, the Levites, they had to be able to eat. They had wives and children, and they had families that they had to support too. And they weren't if you didn't give of your food and you weren't giving money for them to purchase food, then that meant that they had to go grow it themselves back in whatever town it was that they lived in, which means that they were then neglecting their duties at the temple. It created just this big cycle where it wasn't a good situation. And then these people were now completely ignoring the Sabbath, which the purpose of the Sabbath is not because we're created for it, but it was created for us. The idea that we are supposed to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, which is one of the 10 Commandments, and that we are supposed to remember that God is our provider, that it's okay to rest. Now, that doesn't mean, like, you don't feed the animals and you don't do the things that are necessary just in your day-to-day life. Like, you know, bathing, you should do that. But, in eating, fixing your meals. But the concept is that because we believe that God is able to provide for us even when we don't do anything, that was both orthodoxy, and the practice was, we're not going to go out and do any major manual labor. We're not going to go plow the field. We're not going to go to market. We're not going to do these other things. We're going to, like, have the food that we have. You know, mom would put out some dates or, like, whatever, some bread, cheese, whatever they had, and they would eat on that, and they would enjoy just being together as a family and resting that day instead of putting in a lot of work, because they knew that God was going to continue to provide for them. And their practices reflected that. Now they're saying, oh yeah, we believe in the Sabbath, but I'm going to go to market, I'm going to take care of the butchery, and I'm going to get this field plowed, I'm going to, like, get all these things done. And when Nehemiah sees this, he's like, no, close the gate. The gate is closed on Sundays. The merchants, if they want to sit out there, they can sit out there, but just know they aren't coming in. Like, that's the end of it. They're supposed to be reliant on God, and they weren't. And it took someone from the outside, in this case Nehemiah, to come in and look at it and say, like, this is so wrong. What are you even doing? You know better. And then finally, because of how the people were choosing to live and the decisions that they were making, they were denying their children a part of their heritage. So a lot of people, they were intermarrying, now at this point, and children were being born, but they weren't taking the time to actually teach their children their own language. So the heart language that these children, this new generation, was growing up with was the language of all of these people around them. Now, you might say, like, oh, well, what's the problem with that? There's hundreds and thousands of different languages out there. The problem is that Scripture was in Hebrew. And they would gather for the reading of Scripture at the temple, and then the concept that the synagogue had now taken on thanks to the exile. And so Scripture was read in Hebrew. It wasn't translated into a different language. So they needed to be able to understand it. And if they didn't speak it, they weren't going to understand it. Probably the closest thing that I could really liken it to that is more modern, although it's not really a big issue anymore, was, I think it was like in the 70s or maybe early 80s, was when the Catholic Church said that you could do the Mass in whatever like the main language of your parish was. I mean, could you imagine that for hundreds of years, like, people would sit in and hear the reading of Scripture in Latin who didn't speak Latin? They spoke other languages. This is why, like, it was such a big deal whenever William Tyndale translated the Bible into English, and whenever Martin Luther translated the New Testament into German. Besides the fact that it solidified the language and it set like a standard for it, it also made the word available to people. And here we're seeing the complete opposite of that, where the word had been available to the Hebrew people, and then they were they weren't learning the language that it was written in. That it had been written in for hundreds of years at this point. They were choosing to learn the language of a culture that wasn't actually their own, and they were embracing a culture that wasn't theirs, and they were not learning about where it was that they came from, what God had done for them. They were learning that, oh yeah, God's just like this person, and there's this temple, and oh yeah, by the way, we are supposed to not work on Sundays, but or Saturdays for them, but we do it anyway, so it's really not like that big of a deal. And it was a big problem. And I love the book of Nehemiah. It does something for my administrative heart to see how consistent God is, to see the character of God come out, to see how much God remembers. But I have to admit, I get to the last chapter of Nehemiah, and I always feel so heartbroken for the people, because it shows how sinful we are, that we can be given the answers, that we can have it right there in front of us, that we can know what the right thing to do is, and we will still choose to go our own way. We make life harder on ourselves, and that it's not hard to cause the next generation to walk away. I mean, we act as though, like, I don't understand why such and such is chosen. Now, that does happen sometimes, as a parent, like, you will do everything right, and your kids will still, like, they will say, like, this isn't for me, I don't want it, I want nothing to do with God, nothing to do with church, I don't want to be a part of any of your beliefs. That's a decision they make. But I can't help but wonder, though, sometimes, when you see large amounts of people leaving, because I'm a millennial, like, this is like kind of an epidemic with my age group, large group of us leaving, what did mom and dad do at home? Did mom and dad take us to the sporting events on Sunday? Did they go and do all these different things on Sundays? Or did they say, like, no, we value family time, we value the Bible, we value going to church, and we value serving as a family, we value figuring out what our spiritual gifts is, we value being involved and making friends and being a good neighbor to other people, we value having time with God. So I come away from this depressed over how Nehemiah ends, but also encouraged of remembering who God is, And that's the thing I want you to take away from this whole study is remember who God is and how you can go through the book of Nehemiah and you can see the character of God, how consistent he is, how he remembers people, how he cares for people, how he lines things up to bring about his perfect will. I hope you've enjoyed our Bible study since the start of the year. It has been so much fun. We are going to be launching into Ezra. And just as a reminder, if you ever want to go back, and you are always welcome to watch the videos, make sure you like and subscribe, hit the notification so you know whenever new videos come out. But also, you can go to my website and you can actually read all my blog posts that I put up there that coordinate with the lessons, and they actually go live all at the same time. So I hope that you will have an opportunity to go and do that. And the website is www.roadtrippingwithrachael.com. I will see you guys all next time as we get ready to hop into the book of Ezra. Bye.